Hello everyone, this is Tom in Los Angeles. Hope you're doing well. I'm very happy to jump into the Maybe Midrash event and discussion. I've been looking forward to this. And so I'm very thankful to Jason, first of all, at Old Blues Chapter and Verse, who, if I understand correctly, created this event. And the group who is coordinating, whose channels I'm going to put in my description below for sure. Today, I am going to present and talk about, rather than review, one of the 5 books that I've put in my TBR for maybe Midrash. And this book is Why God Won't Go Away. The author is Andrew Newberg, together with Eugene Daquili, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. So it's a book by 2 scientists. Andrew Newberg in particular is a neuroscientist. And the very striking thing about this book is that it is a book about science, about experiments and scientific concepts. But obviously the title itself is slightly provocative because it wants to address directly the spiritual experience and, if we want to call it like that, the religious experience as well. So what I'm going to do in this video is to try and hit on the 10 main points that this book is making. And I'm going to try to be as concise as I can. For anybody who is coming to this video or to my channel for the first time, let's talk about perspectives. I am a Catholic, and the author of this book, Andrew Newberg, he is not a Christian. He is a neuroscientist, and from what I understand, he falls, roughly speaking, in the agnostic field. I wouldn't want to talk for him, of course, but it sounds like that's where he falls. So point number 1, and maybe the most fascinating one, most interesting one, which the book opens with, it's an experiment, or a series of experiments to be precise. I believe many of you have heard about scans and ways to scientifically measure the brain activity during a spiritual experience. That might be a meditation, a prayer, or some type of mystic activity. In this particular experiment, the scientific team measured the brain of some Buddhist monks and also of some Franciscan nuns, Christian nuns, while the Buddhist monks were meditating and while the nuns were praying. They were given, all these subjects of the experiment were given a piece of string so that they were laying down and praying to God or meditating. And when they were achieving, after maybe 30 minutes or 1 hour, a sort of peak moment of peace and happiness with their practice, they would pull the string, because that would mean they would be ready to be measured in their brain. And that's how the experiment was conducted. The finished scan images that the scientists received were displaying immediately an unusual type of activity in one specific area of the brain of all the subjects, no matter if they were Buddhist or Christian or some other type of denomination. This type of area of the brain is technically called the posterior superior parietal lobe, but for ease of purpose and for this book, the authors have dubbed it the Orientation Association Area, or the OAA. What does this Orientation Association Area do? It's because what it is, it's a lump of gray matter in the back of our head. That's exactly what it is. The purpose of it, the primary purpose of this OAA, is to help us understand our position in space, to understand our orientation, to understand where is up, where is down, left and right, and while doing this, create an understanding or an image of ourselves in space, and a striking difference or a striking delimitation between whatever is me and whatever is non-me. So whatever is the self and whatever is the non-self. And this really leads to fascinating consequences. So what is this unusual activity that they discovered in the back of the subject's brain? This unusual activity can be described as an unusual drop of intensity and of activity in this OAA brain area. It has to be explained in some way. And so what Newberg did with this team, they asked themselves these questions. They asked, what if the orientation area was actually still working as hard as ever, despite the drop in activity that is measured, but the incoming flow of sensory information had somehow been blocked or decreased? In other words, what would happen if this orientation association area had no information upon which to work? And the scientist's answer is, in this case, which is obviously an extreme, we are talking about a continuum. In this meditation, in this prayer, they only measured a decrease in activity, but not a complete disappearance of the neural activity. But if there was a complete, if there was no information at all going to this area, the brain would have no choice but to perceive that the self is endless and intimately interwoven with everyone and everything the mind senses. Number 2. At this point, I'm going straight to the book's general conclusions, so that later on I'm going to describe the context from which these conclusions come from. Can all spirituality and any experience of the reality of God be reduced to a fleeting rush of electrochemical blips and flashes? Based on our current understanding of science, and based on the manner in which the brain turns the neural input into the perceptions of human experience, the simplest answer is yes. Are we saying then, second question, that God is just an idea with no more absolute substance than a fantasy or a dream, based upon our best understanding of how the mind interprets the perception of the brain? The simplest answer is no. Gradually, we shaped a hypothesis that suggests that spiritual experience, at its very root, is interwoven intimately with human biology. And this biology, in some way, compels the spiritual urge. So this team of scientists are really making the point that the spiritual urge, or in other words, the religious instinct, and we can call it really many other ways, but this is what it is something universal that we all share within our brain. There's obviously a huge variety of this type of experiences, but the point that the author is making here is that we should not, if we want to be scientifically correct, we should not dismiss them all as simply misfiring or delusions, because their scans suggested another possibility. This orientation association area, or OAA, is working unusually during this type of experiences, but not improperly. And after years of scientific study and consideration of our results, we believe that we saw evidence of a neurological process that has evolved to allow us humans to transcend material existence and acknowledge and connect with a deeper, more spiritual part of ourselves, perceived of as an absolute, universal reality that connects us to all that is. I find this extremely exciting. In fact, I find this mind-blowing, to be completely honest. This is the reason why there is a certain almost epistemological shift from when we look at this orientation association area as something that prehistorically has evolved for survival, to help us in space, to perceive ourselves, to perceive whatever is not ourselves, but in time evolved to help us grow something that is our sense of self, not only physically, but also our mind, our soul, our consciousness. And the more we enter in a particular state, we can call it in a particular dimension, the less we feel our sense of self and our sense of typical egotistical reference to everything that we perceive, and the more we feel open to what we really are, which is a part of everything, a part of the absolute. The book in itself does not talk about God's existence or non-existence at all. I hope this is clear. Point number 3. This is about the experience of reality from our brain standpoint. Only from a scientific point of view, everything that we experience as reality is only or simply a rendition of reality, because it's a rendition of reality that is created by our brain. Everything, from science to materials to spiritual to everything else. Therefore, we can certainly say, under this point of view, that everything is a representation. And we can go back to Plato as well. There is a clear distinction between science and truth. This is something that Albert Einstein knew very well and wrote about, even if he wasn't a religious person. But he said one thing is science and one thing is truth. He had this distinction very clear in his mind. Point number 4. All these type of practices and activities described and analyzed in the book, like meditation and transcendence, transcendence of the ego and materiality, all of these activities exist on a certain continuum. And this is important when trying to understand this type of experiments, because the authors talk about de-afferentation, which is the phenomenon that happens when no information at all enters this orientation association area, this OAA. And that is an extreme that very rarely is achieved by anybody. We could maybe think about this nirvana states that Eastern practices talk about, but it's very, very unusual. It's much more common to be on the lower end of this continuum, where we have what the others call mild unitary sensations, which is something you might feel when you're going to church, for example, in a moving type of mass situation. As we move along the continuum, you can have feelings of spiritual awe and rapture, maybe if you increase the length of intensity. Beyond this, you have these profound states of spiritual union that have been described by the mystics of every tradition, religious tradition, but also outside of religion. And those are extreme and unusual. But the fascinating point is that the authors say, as scientific observers, we realize that virtually all these mystical techniques seem to have been devised by religions and not to trigger the process of de-afferentation. Point number 5 is very complex, and I'm going to try to summarize it in the simplest way that I can, which is the evolution of this type of mechanism. We can formulate some theories about how and why this type of mechanisms in our brain have evolved. One striking thing that I learned from this book is that this type of mechanism that is present in our brain and that seems to rotate around the orientation association area in particular, but also in other parts of the brain, seems to have its origin in the evolution of the sexual behaviors and the mating rituals of human beings. In other words, the neurological structures and pathways involved in transcendent experience, including the arousal and limbic systems, evolved primarily to link sexual climax to the powerful sensations of orgasm. The mechanism of orgasm is activated by repetitive rhythmic stimulation, which remind us of mantra repetition and some kind of rituals as well. And significantly, orgasm requires the simultaneous stimulation of both the arousal and our quiescent systems in the brain. What does this all mean? It fundamentally means that this innate ability to experience a spiritual union, a spiritual connection with everything, is difficult to think of as directly pushed by evolution, but it could be a byproduct of sexual evolution. And again, this is a really fascinating aspect of the development of our brain. Point 6. While it's unlikely for the authors, based on their research, that the neurological machinery of transcendence evolved specifically for spirituality, like they said, probably from sexual mechanisms, still, they believe that evolution has adopted this machinery and has favored the religious capabilities of the religious brain, because religious beliefs and behaviors turn out to be good for us in profound ways, physical ways. This particular statement goes clearly against the most cynical or dismissive or even paternalistic type of attitudes that can be found sometimes in Nietzsche. For example, Nietzsche is quoted here as he was saying that humans cling to God because they lack the strength and courage to face the world without him. This would be a simply psychological reason, and the argument made in this book is that there is a lot more than psychological reasons for which our brain favors the religious experience or the spiritual experience. And these reasons are, in fact, physiological, they're biological. Point number 7. What are these physiological benefits that can come from these transcendental experiences, activities, and practices? For the individual believer, it's a gift of hope, but on a larger scale, its effects have been more profound, lifting humanity out of fear and futility and giving us the sense that wise hands are steering the cosmic bus. Religion in itself has served as a powerful source of confidence and motivation that may also have been a crucial reason why the human race has managed to survive. This is simply a hypothesis, but it's along these lines that we understand that there is something much more than the simple criticism to religion as a whole as some type of cognitive process based on faulty logic and incorrect delusions. A neurological approach, however, suggests that God is not the product of a cognitive deductive process, but was instead discovered in a mystical or spiritual encounter made known to human consciousness through the transcendent machinery of the mind. In other words, humans do not cognitively invent a powerful God and then depend upon this invention to gain the feeling of control. It's the other way around. God, in the broadest and most fundamental definition of the term, is experienced in mystical spirituality, and this type of experiences of the presence of God make the possibility of control apparent. Point 8 is the consequence and conclusion from the previous 2 or 3 points, where the authors of this book say, we believe that neurology of transcendence borrows the neural circuitry, the circuits of the sexual response. But the strong survival advantages of religious belief make it very likely that evolution would enhance the neurological wiring that makes transcendence possible. This inherited ability to experience spiritual union is the real source of religion's staying power, and the reason why the authors felt like titling this book, Why God Won't Go Away. Point number 9. It's very interesting where the authors trace back their own experience in their life and how historically they evolved their worldview based on their scientific experiments. As I said in the beginning, they are not Christians, they are not even religious as far as I understand. But what they say is that when they started in their career, they were young, they regarded the brain simply as a biological machine, everything was material for them, and there was nothing true outside of the material things, the objects that can be measured and can be proven, demonstrated, etc., etc. After years of research, however, our understanding of various key brain structures and the way information is channeled along the neural pathways led us to hypothesize that the brain possesses a neurological mechanism for self-transcendence, which is what they've been talking about for the book. In the narrow scientific view, it would be possible to believe that they had reduced all spiritual transcendence or religious transcendence to a neurochemical commotion in the brain. This is something that is very easy to jump to as a conclusion, but it's not right. Our understanding of the brain would not allow us to rest with that conclusion. Why? Because if you were to dismiss spiritual experience as purely neurological activity, you would also have to distrust all your other brain's perceptions, including the perception of the material world and even including the sense of yourself. So we go back to the initial point of how our brain perceives reality and what is reality for our brain. If we dismiss spiritual experiences as imagination, neurological, as something that is to be dismissed because it's imaginary, then we need to dismiss everything else in our life. On the other hand, if we do trust our perceptions of the physical world, we have no rational reason to declare that spiritual experience is a fiction that is only in the mind. And finally, as the last point number 10, the authors question all the different type of approaches to spirituality that history and people all over the world have always brought up. And it's interesting because we go back to the point of if you think your God is the only true one, then what about all the other 5,000, 6,000, etc., etc.? Which, again, in my opinion, it's a superficial objection. The authors are quoting the Dalai Lama, where he says that it should come as no surprise at all that we have many different religious traditions with different ways of thinking and behaving. This variety is a way for everyone to be happy. If we only have bread, for example, people who eat rice would be left out. The great variety of food is able to satisfy everyone's different tastes and needs. The fact that people eat rice is because it grows best where they are, where they live, and not because it's necessarily the best food or the only real food. I love this type of approach, and there are many signs from many religious traditions. It's not really the point of this book to talk about interreligiosity or interspirituality, but one author who is quoted by these authors is Wayne Teasdale. He wrote about the religious experience, and he talked about interspirituality, the commonality between many different spiritual systems. And he said interspirituality is not about eliminating the world's rich diversity of religion expression. And it's not about rejecting this tradition's individuality for a homogeneous type of super spirituality. And it has nothing to do with a world global hug where one God is equal to every other God. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is an attempt to make available to everyone all the forms that the spiritual journey assumes, always starting from our brain, which is the same for everybody. I think this makes an incredible amount of sense. I think that coming from scientists who are not religious is remarkable as a fundamental point. And I really love this book. I wanted to present these 10 points to make sure that I shared with you what really fascinated me about it and why I find it worth introducing my conversation into maybe midrash. And at this point, I would love to, that's my hope, that I was as clear as possible. But obviously, with this type of topics is not always easy at all. So I'd love to continue with the dialogue with you, with other videos, and in the comments. For now, thank you so much for watching.